Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I'm back here with Pastor Brian. And although
Hello.
Lucifer is over, and we'll probably still find some things to talk about when we rewatch Lucifer episodes, but for now, we want to go a little farther afield, and we're going to be talking a bit about the Bible. And, Satan and Lucifer may show up sometimes. We'll find out. For today, we want to look at the first 3 chapters of Genesis. We thought this is our first one where we're just going to be talking Bible stuff. So let's start right at the beginning of the Bible. So I will throw it out to Brian to make an opening statement about something he wants to say about, say, chapter 1 of Genesis, where God says, let there be various things.
So much to say. I mean, if you've been watching all of our dozens of these, you've heard me say over and over that, nobody who wrote down the Bible wrote it for us, and certainly never expected anyone to read it the way people are trying to force us to read it here. So it's their experience of God. But what's really funny when you get to Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 is it's so clearly some of the latest writings down. Maybe those stories existed, but they're so clearly reflecting Babylonian, as Zoroastrian, and certainly Greek influences, that it's very clear that those stories were framed very late, written down very late. We're talking like maybe 300 before the Common Era. And of course, we're talking about Moses at 2500 before the Common Era is the myth, maybe. I could be wrong. Is it 1500? No, I think 2500, right? And so, it's all just, so, but what really, it's a culture that definitely passed on oral tradition. And it was a culture that was very good at passing on oral tradition. So I'm not going to say that it wildly varied from storyteller to storyteller, but certainly over time, all stories deal with the agenda, with the community, and with their understanding of God. That's all the Bible is. It's a library of people's testimony of their understanding of God in a very difficult world. And the final thing I really want to say before we get started is, the people who told these stories and the people who wrote them down and the people who followed them for the last couple millennia are every bit as intelligent as we are, as loving as we are. It's just that they did not have the benefit of science and psychology, and certain technologies. They didn't even have the awareness of what people at the same time a few hundred miles away were saying, much less that we can look back at all these archaeological records. So while I'm going to talk about the people in the Bible, not understanding things the way we understand things, that is not a put down to them. And it also doesn't mean that we're smarter or more loving or caring. It just means that we understand the world differently because we have a lot more technology and psychology and science. Yeah.
So I mentioned to Brian a little bit earlier that one of the things I saw someone say on television just last week, I watched a lot of YouTube, so it was probably on a YouTube video, that basically the stories in the Bible were written in the order that they are now. So that the first chapter of Genesis would have been the first thing that anybody ever wrote down, which is not true. I mean, there's a lot of, I'm not sure how many people would have that point of view. I mean, just because it was arranged that way doesn't mean that's the way, the order that things were written in historically. What I've seen about the first chapter of Genesis is that this was probably really consolidated during the exile because the Israelites wanted to keep their identity. And so they wanted to, now they're living among people for whom the moon is a god and the sun is a god, and all these things are gods, so that they wanted to have a story that said God created the moon, right? God created the stars, God created the sun, to show and to pass on the important information that Yahweh created all those things. They were just creations. They were not gods in and of themselves. And so this was like a teaching story to make sure your kids grew up knowing your God and knew not to go sacrifice to a moon goddess here or a sun god there. Those gods are not gods of things. Those things are just creations of Yahweh. And I also liked your point about, oral traditions will change. Sometimes this does kind of bother me when I see people presenting an oral tradition and then saying, this is how we know something happened in ancient history or whatever. No, you don't really know that. There are some cultures where anthropologists went there in like the 40s and 50s, and they would record people singing certain songs or saying certain tales. They come back 40 years later, the same person is still telling the same stories. Okay, so it's even the same person, but they're not telling it quite the same way. A word's been changed here, or something's been deleted over there, or there's a little addition, another little detail of the story has been added somewhere. And but the culture feels like the stories don't change. So even if you play that recording to the storyteller and say, look, here's how you did it 40 years ago, and here's how you did it yesterday, they're changed. The storyteller will insist, no, they're exactly the same. And anybody you play those recordings to will say, no, they're exactly the same, even though they clearly are not. Because that's what is important in the cultures, for the oral tradition to remain absolutely fixed in stone. But that's impossible. As humans, we just can't do that level of accurate repeating that many times. We just make changes. It just happens. So we have to understand that people were telling these stories, wanted them maybe not to change, and felt like they hadn't changed and they've been the same forever. But that doesn't mean they were the same forever. So by the time they get to the exile, the Israelites then start writing down their stories. Those stories have been passed down for a long time, and they're not the same stories that they would have been maybe even in their grandfather's time.
And you brought up something earlier, which we'll probably get into a different episode, but just the idea of, to give your story weight, you want to say that it's ancient and comes from someone else, right? Like, so that's what gives the authority to what you're saying. It doesn't give your story enough authority to say, well, this is how I see it, right? Even though that's a lot of what's happening. You know, we're talking hermeneutics, a word I never use as a pastor, but how we interpret the Bible. And so that's another one that's key in all my seminary studies, every seminary professor I had, but specifically the dean, who's now the president at Eden. And my professors at Eden were particularly, this was a word they always hit us all the time: context, 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 everything's context. And something they said that just has struck me so much in how I approach the Bible always is that not only were those people different peoples, right? At different times, those stories were changing. The context changes constantly. Like, and again, in a time pre-technology, pre-science, you can't even understand the story that was passed on, maybe necessarily. Maybe some understanding that was a given to how the story was passed on to you, you now understand it in a totally different way and explain it in a different way. Kind of like if we try and explain what cassette tape mixes were, right? Like the Gen Z lacks the context to understand what we're saying. But much more important than that, not just, so you can't ever get original intent. I'm just gonna say that right now. Don't ever tell me you're gonna understand original intent of the Constitution or of the Bible. It's all nonsense. But mostly, every time I read the Bible, I am different. My context is different. So these people coming to tell this story, you know, maybe they've lost a child, you know, maybe they've just had a big, beautiful victory, maybe that, you know, and so the context of how they're telling the stories changes, and even the context of how they rewrote them, right? We see that in as we're finding older and older scrolls, that like the texts even change. So it's just a silly idea to say it was passed on as is. And of course, how are you going to do that? Well, nowadays it's not enough to say it's old. We're going to say God passed it on exactly in God's word. None of that applies, in my opinion, when approaching the Bible. It is the testimony of different people in different places over time of how they experienced the world and what they called God. Yeah.
So one of the places we see that in the first chapter is it 126 or 125? I think it's 26, where God says, we will make man in our own image. And we still have that plural, even in the English translations. So right up front, you're kind of thinking, okay, what's going on here? I thought there was just one God. And yet here's God referring to himself in the plural. And I assume that people are going to say, or some Christians are going to say, well, that's God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, right? There's three in one, so therefore it's plural. But what we see in the Old Testament is not a triune God. It's people have multiple gods. And so we see that in that chapter in the original, right, as you pointed out earlier, that Elohim is the word used there, and that is the plural of the word. So God is speaking in the plural. And we do see this god El elsewhere in the Old Testament. I think it's the book of Isaiah, where El is sitting on top of a mountain, and he is like the old bearded Zeus looking like God who sits on a mountain and dispenses wisdom in the Old Testament. And that's when you see the word El pop up. And El has the 70 sons of God, and Yahweh is the one that he gives Palestine to. He gives each one of these 70 sons of God parts of the world to rule. So right there in that little verse in Isaiah, you see, at least, I guess, 71 gods.
You have a lot of El. You have a lot of El used even for the Hebrew or the Israelite, or depending on what era, the God of the people we came to call Jews. You have El Shaddai, right? Amy Grant sang it for us, those of us of a certain age. Elyon, right? Like over and over and over, you have them using the word El as a descriptor for their God, who they believe is better than other gods. So that's absolutely no question. And I agree. Elohim in Genesis 1 is one thing. And then you go on to Genesis 2, 3, and you get Yahweh. You get different names for God that mean different things. And just calling Genesis 2's God Yahweh, like Yahweh is a concept from way later, right? Like that's David's God, right? And so it's just so clear that there's no chronological record that is being reproduced in how you do that. But I'm going to go way earlier than you. I'm going to go right to the very opening where they say, in the beginning, God was, there was nothingness over a dark, watery chaos. And the word tofu vavohu that they use in Hebrew, the name, it's a Zoroastrian goddess. I always want to say Tirhut.
Tiamat.
What is the Tiamat? They're literally
it's Dungeons and Dragons. Tiamat's a big dragon in Dungeons.
Yeah, so they're literally alluding to Zoroastrianism and the word that they use, right? It's not standard Hebrew words that they're using there, right? They're using tohu vavohu. That right away in the very beginning of the Hebrew Bible tells us that it's influenced. Some can say, I guess, that it was redacted later, right? But I don't believe it was written down until they were in Babylon and even come back, and a lot of it written down when the Greeks were trying to eliminate their culture, because that was how they preserved their culture in the face of Greek eradication. So it's right there in the beginning of Genesis 1.
We have this whole formless void and like the earth being brought out of water in a lot of old creation myths. I mean, the Egyptian myth is the same thing. We would have chaos and then this sort of muddy piles in the middle of it. So everybody was kind of passing around a lot of those ideas. And it does make a lot of sense because people are living on rivers, right? So you're seeing the floods every spring. You're, seeing all this growth from the floodwaters and stuff. So just the fact that your whole creation myth is kind of like the land coming out of the floodwaters, and then you're able to plant your crops and stuff, it just, that's what they were living around.
Yeah, and creationists will hate it, but we came from the waters, right? Like we evolved out of the waters, so that really get the creationists going. But it's funny. And then right away, and right after what we're talking about today, we have the flood, right? Which again mirrors so many Middle Eastern, if not global, but Middle Eastern traditions, right? It's so clear. They're telling stories of how they experience the world, and they're trying to make meaning of them. And so things they can't control to them are God, right? And and they're never saying early on in the Hebrew scriptures, at least this is, rabbis are the expert on this. So, but from what all the rabbis I've been taught by and listened to and gone to synagogue to hear, that it was never this point of there's only one God. It's that our God is our God. And as long as we're faithful to our God, we will endure no matter how hard it gets. Whereas if we follow the other gods, we will disappear. And that's very practically true. We've already said that. They're trying to preserve themselves around other cultures that are more powerful, more violent, more successful, more prosperous, and more fun, maybe even. And so how do you keep the kids down on the farm when they're seeing the neighbors? You have to understand that if we're faithful to our God, we will endure and they will not.
Yeah, I think another point we can bring up here maybe as we move toward chapter 2 is that really if you just sit down and read those 3 chapters together, clearly the character of God in the first chapter is not the same God as the one who's going to show up in chapters 2 and 3, because the God in chapter 1 is very, very powerful, very, I'm kind of omniscient and everything. Here's God's face moving across the water, or God's spirit moving across the waters, and God says, let there be light, let there be this. And it's a very kind of a remote kind of God who's just sort of creating things. But by the time you get, in reading 2 and 3, now this is a much more personal God. He's walking through a garden, he's walking through the cool of the evening. He's, kind of creating things out of mud. He's much smaller and does not seem nearly as powerful. When he wants to make woman, he has to cast Adam into a sleep and take a rib and fashion a woman, whereas the God in the first chapter is just like, we're going to make God and man in our own image, and he just makes them. Male and female, he created them, right? So, but the God in chapter 2 and chapter 3 is kind of like, I got to figure out how to do this because I'm much smaller, much less powerful.
And again, I think I see a lot of Greek influence in that because, previous Hebrew stories, God commands, right? You have the covenant with God, and God says, this is it, and it's our job to uphold the covenant. But in here, again, very early in the text, but God leans near to humans. God wants relationship with humans. God gives up some of God's godness to be in relationship with humans. We have here a story of understanding that God is immanent as well as transcendent, more seminary words, so that God is right here among us, as opposed to only out there puppeting us or ordering us. And it still shows through a little bit in one, a totally different story, where they say it is good and in God's own image and it is good, right? That's pretty intimate with God, but that is still from a very top down view where all of a sudden and now, of course, then, this God who leans near to us also acts like a human all the time, because then we get all these crazy tests and temper tantrums and things, which if God's God, again, that's not a God that I'm going to worship. But
we find the whole Garden of Eden story doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, if it's like the teaching story for your kids, it's trying to show you your relationship with God. That's one way to use it. But if you're just going to look at the story itself, it's kind of nonsensical. Where God makes this nice garden, he puts the people in the garden. Well, first he just puts Adam in the garden, and then guessing we're not supposed to read bestiality into this, but God then wants to find a helper for Adam, the perfect helpmeet, right? And parades all the animals in front of them. And after Adam tries them all out and finds that none of them are for him, then God makes a woman. And okay, I'm not quite sure how much you're supposed to read into that. But so then God makes a woman, and then God puts this tree in the garden and says, hey, I know I put this cool tree with this really nifty fruit and it's right in the middle of everything, but you can't eat it. And for in that day you will die. And so, of course, but these people haven't eaten of the tree, which is the knowledge of good and evil, right? So they don't have any capacity to understand about disobedience. They're infants, basically. And God's just basically put a baby in the middle of the floor and put a lollipop next to it and said, don't eat the lollipop, what's going to happen? And 2 minutes later, once you turn your back, right? So the fact that God does this whole crazy shtick with the tree is clearly a teaching tool, but it can't possibly be something God would do if God is indeed omnipotent and omniscient and omnibenevolent. This is psychopathic. It's if God had those omni attributes, you wouldn't do that.
Yeah. And I mean, Genesis 1 obviously echoes so many creation myths around the world, but then 2, rather than trying to see it, what if we were to, rather than try and see it as an explanation of how the world works or how we came about, but instead it's humans understanding the relationships to each other, the relationships to the land. They're showing their love, they're showing loving, they're showing passion, they're showing care, intimacy, all these things. Now they're doing it in the way that a very different people in very different circumstances understood it. But it's very much showing values, and they're attributing to God and to people, and the other thing they're doing, and I struggle with this, In my master's thesis, we had to do a chapter on sin. And, I'm a stereotypical progressive pastor that doesn't like to talk about sin. But, they're really emphasizing on the fact that, what came to be called the original sin, right? But they're really emphasizing this idea that there is a instinct in us toward doing the wrong thing. But that's just how they understand the world. And I love the idea of a tree as this great temptation, because again, I keep going back to the story of you have to stay faithful to our little tribe, or else we will be forsaken and disappear, right? And even in Judaism today, right, what's the most important thing for a lot of Jewish people is to pass on Judaism to the next generation, especially if you don't believe in an afterlife, which many Jewish folks don't and didn't. So this idea of don't be tempted by those, same gender temple prostitutes that the Canaanites down the road go and have a lot of fun with, right? Don't be tempted by their big harvest when we had a drought, right? Don't be tempted to go just pretend to be one of them in order to eat, right? Because if we stay faithful to our tribe with our rules, our God, then we will ultimately persevere.
So in chapter 3, we get the whole story with the serpent. This seems to be a favorite, I guess, of modern evangelistic Christians who want to make the serpent Satan, to show the fall and original sin, I guess. And but there's just no way that this serpent can be anything but a snake. I mean, it's a snake. Because again, you have, otherwise God is a psychopath, because at the end of the chapter, when Adam says, well, the woman gave me the fruit, so I ate it, because women, what are you going to do? And the woman's like, well, the snake told me it was okay, and then God curses the snake, you'll go on your belly and you'll bruise his heel and he'll bruise your head or whatever. Well, why would God punish all snakes forever to crawl on their belly if it was really, Satan? You'd think that he would curse Satan and leave the snakes alone. So clearly it's a snake. And the snake tells the truth. I mean, people say, well, the snake was a liar. It was the most clever, subtle, I think is the word in KJV. But the snake only says two things, and they're both right. It tells Eve, if you eat of this, you'll be able to understand the difference between good and evil, which is true. And it tells her, if you eat of this, you're not going to die. At least not today. And that's true too, because God said, if you eat of this, in that day you will die. And they eat of it, and they still live for like 900 more years. So, the serpent was telling the truth. And God is this weird, crazy dude who comes and first can't find them. So obviously a very small God. It's walking through, hey, Adam, where are you? I can't find you anywhere. And then here comes Adam and Eve, and they're ashamed because they disobeyed. Because now they understand, right? Now they have the understanding of when someone tells you to do something, you should do it, which they couldn't really understand before. So, and then they get kicked out of the garden after getting cursed. So,
yeah, I mean, there's so much in it, but I love, again, one of the things we would do often is to try and step back from like all our teaching of what we've been taught to understand it. And especially to try, it's impossible, but try and step back from our context where we cast all this into Christianity right away, right? Those of us who are born and raised in Christian culture. So, but right, again, I do think it's fascinating to look at like this irrational God. Well, God is irrational. I say even now, but certainly when life is just so unbelievably capricious and hard, and there's just, no matter what you do right, it just gets harder and harder and harder, and you die, and so it's just kind of an interesting theory that people will try and twist people's understanding of theodicy, of difficult things. All these seminary words are coming to me today that I never use, of difficult things. And what really becomes sick is when people try and say that's because God loves us, right? Like, no, that is not love. Abuse is not love. Neglect is not love. Imposing hardship, especially choosing to hearts, but to folks who are at the complete whim of the universe, that makes sense. And what's interesting is, in nowadays, when people suffer so much trauma, people who really are completely targeted and at the bottom of social structures, who have really no experience of ever having a moment of self-actualization, that society realizes, it makes sense that they're going to latch on to this idea of punishment is love, right? And so then you have the opiate of saying, but that's okay because eventually I'll be in heaven, but that's just not all in there, I don't think. I think this is just some people, and especially understanding how Greek gods operate, right? They're so capricious, they're so temperamental, they're so unfair, right? And so I really think as they're writing this down, they're doing their theory of our God may be a hard God, but we must stick to our God, because that's all that we have, right?
I think we don't have a really good understanding of how things were for people. We went camping last year a couple of times during the pandemic because you can still socially distance and be in your tent, in a campground. And so one night we were walking to the bathhouse, and there's all these like pairs of yellow eyes watching us. and they're raccoons, right? 'Cause in this part of the world, it's going to be a raccoon. And yet it was still kind of creepy. I was kind of cool creepy because it's like, whoa, it's just like all these eyes are, ringing us and watching us. But it wasn't scary for us, and it wasn't, we let it be a little creepy because it was kind of fun. But in these times when people are writing these things down, it's not fun. The eyes that are surrounding your campfire at night, they're probably wolves. They could be lions. You don't know.
Hey, let's face it, raccoons are mean. Raccoons are not the friendliest.
I think they were going to run out of the woods and,
right. They're scared of you, yeah.
So we in the dark too. When you're out camping, you finally get like when it's no moon or whatever, and it's dark, right? Absolutely dark. So the fact that there's a light on the bathhouse, whatever, you can at least find it, But you're thinking if I were living 1,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and I didn't know what those eyes were, and everything was completely dark, and I just had my little bitty fire here, and do I have enough firewood to last till morning or something? It would be freaking scary. And having this life where in any day some other tribe could just come over the hill and just wipe you all out or enslave you all or whatever, that's scary. And we don't live like that now, right? It's hard to understand the absolute darkness. It's hard to understand being afraid of what's beyond your campfire. It's hard to understand that the people 2 miles away who you've maybe never talked to may just come tomorrow morning before dawn and wipe all of you out. And so these are the kind of people who are latching on to these kind of like, we see them as like little gods, but because they don't seem that powerful, but they're what you have to hold on to, right? They're someone you can communicate with, human-like enough that they understand you, but at the same time, God-like enough to be very capricious. So if you do get wiped out, even though you did everything right and you said the right prayers, well, maybe they're just mad at you or something, or you did something wrong you didn't realize you did wrong or whatever. So you can still explain it away, but you still have this God to latch onto that's bigger than a human, but not remote, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, that's so true. Just this idea of, not seeking, you're not seeking like, oh, this is when I'll get rewarded, but you're literally just trying to endure. And I guess, people must have looked at each other and, deeply loved so many people they lost so violently, so early, so often, so, well, what do you want to do? You want to have as many kids as you can, because hopefully if you do for some reason live long, who's going to help you and take care of you and make you comfortable and happy in your old age, until you die violently or in some deprivation or whatever. But I also think about that at night. Like here in the desert, it's kind of cool. It's big sky country. So this is unique for me. We don't have these big, beautiful trees everywhere here, but you just see the sky forever. And it is so obvious on a moonless night how dark it gets. And I just can't even imagine how often, you're alone with your maybe your insular family, or maybe you're out hunting or whatever, and it is pitch black, and you literally, there is no light to run to, right? And maybe you're hungry, and maybe you're out of crops, and it's not season to harvest more crops yet. Like, yeah, absolutely, just completely terror all the time. Yeah, we must be careful not to project our understanding, much less. That's again why I say stop trying to get to the original intent. We can't. It's absolutely impossible. It's absolutely impossible.
Yeah, I did see an article once where they said that there are certain times in history where the person who lives after this time just would not be able to understand the world from before that time. And a couple of the periods I'd picked more recently were pre and post Sigmund Freud, because now we'll talk about the unconscious without even thinking that 100 years ago people might have discussed the unconscious or the ego. And then the other thing they mentioned was like, the scientific revolution. So someone speaking to someone before that and someone after that would have trouble connecting. Well, even more than someone in the Bronze Age who's grown up in a tribe of 30 or 40 people, and your neighbors are not necessarily your friends, and you have a few goats, and maybe your neighbors come and steal all your goats and you starve to death or something. I mean, your life is so precarious, and almost anything can disrupt it. You have no doctors, basically. You get a wound and you're going to get sepsis and die. So life is just so cheap and so easily taken by almost anything, including stumbling and, getting a cut, that we just don't, it would, if you were able to meet your 10, 50 times great grandfather or whatever, would you even be able to really communicate? Even if you spoke the same language, you somehow, just the concepts that you live with and the ideas and the biases and the understanding you take of the world to the conversation is just going to be so different from them.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, absolutely. And like, just think when COVID came around, how many people who had a default opinion and a default understanding of things did not even know about the Spanish flu epidemic, right? I mean, and we have all this available to us to at least know it happened, to know that, like, or even all the people who lived through AIDS but thought it didn't apply to them, and so didn't even use that as a reference to kind of approach this. But you don't even have to go that far back to like the U.S. frontier when it was like Kentucky, Tennessee, and John Wesley riding around on just the lives of those people, right? And not just their conflicts with indigenous people, but also with any European enemies that were coming around, and then just the natural hardships and difficulties. The Oregon Trail. I'm here in El Paso, and all these stories about how people ended up here. It's just, you don't have to go back that far to be a world that, no matter how much I studied, I cannot possibly comprehend what that was like. I'll never get that context. Even today, I don't understand the context of being a black man in the United States. I cannot, no matter what, no matter how many black people I love, no matter how much time I spend around black people, I can't understand. And so here we're trying to say we understand what these people meant from prehistoric stories that were written down at least 300 years before the Common Era. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's the first 3 chapters in Genesis, kind of.
We're not going chapter by chapter.
We're not going chapter by chapter, but we thought we'd start at the beginning. In the beginning, Pastor Brian and Morella said a bunch of things. But we will be looking at some other areas of the Old Testament, maybe the New Testament as well. We'll probably go back and revisit the ideas of hell and Satan and how they're really not in the Old Testament at all. And that understanding of things is really much more modern, if you want to put the Middle Ages, I guess, as modern, but more modern than the Bronze Age anyway. And so we'll be talking about a lot of stuff. If you want to see us talk about something in particular, put it down in the comments, and I'm sure we would take a look and see what interesting things we could find to talk about that would also interest you. If you like this, please hit like and subscribe. I finally hit 200 subscribers a couple months ago. I'm so excited. But 201 subscribers would be good too. So anyway, I'll let Pastor Brian say anything to sum up if he wants.
Just, I hated the Hebrew Bible when I entered seminary, right? And I had taught religion forever. I always avoided trying to teach the Hebrew scriptures when I was a religion teacher because I just didn't enjoy it. I didn't like it. And part of that was my own limitations and my own struggles. And as I recovered, as I learned to be able to get out of my own experience and to like try and listen and hear something different, all of a sudden in seminary, I fell in love with the Hebrew scriptures. But none of that is based on me thinking I have found some secret knowledge that just the rest of you don't understand, right? And my final thing that's so important is, rabbis, please, you are the experts. We are in no way trying to tell you what your scriptures mean, but we do try and share with other people who maybe have our context what we have understood from you, and we probably get it wrong, so please let us know if we do.
Certainly leave us comments if your understanding of the scriptures that certainly better than ours. But having said that, we'll say goodbye for now, and we'll be back later with more Infernal Intercourse. So thanks for listening and watching. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.